Yeah, I'm ready. have two programs today, and I'd like to get started and try to stay on schedule, because I realize it is the end of the week and people would like to try to get going into it. This is the calling to order for the summit, and we'll have a summit agenda, and immediately with the conclusion of that, we'll take about a 10 to 15 minute break and then go into the regular session for the day. So I'll call the meeting to order, and we'll start with a roll call. And I'm Dr. Wayne Lee, Mike Patah, Manuel Gonzalez. Here. Kerry Hatley. Here. Mick Menard. Chris Reed.
Present.
Dr. Schramm.
Present.
Dr. Sabot. Mr. Sabot.
Here.
And Dr. Taylor.
Here.
All right. We have enough for a quorum. I'll sign off on this. Today is the 18th? Yes. No, 20th.
20th.
Yeah, I'm behind. Okay. Next on the agenda is the certification of the quorum, and I just did that. And so we'll move to the next issue, which is introductions, and Jim?
Good morning, Jim Erickson, Combative Sports Program. Today we're looking at a summit format to share information before we move into our board meeting. We have two speakers with us today that we'll bring up later, Dr. Taylor, who you all know, as well as Scott Smith with Austin Mobile Drug Testing. I'm going to kick off this with following the agenda and talk about the overview of drug testing protocols first, and then we'll have Mr. Smith come up and speak. We all know the combative sports industry is evolving. Whether it's MMA, boxing, kickboxing, or Muay Thai, the dynamics of these sports are changing. To stay abreast of these changes, TDLR Combative Sports Program needs to examine and perhaps realign our regulation of combative sports. As we open discussion regarding our first topic, drug testing, we can find the changes that we have seen in the past 10 years, 5 years, or even 1 year. The changes in public attitude, the proliferation of performance-enhancing drugs and their associated masking agents, and the wide variation of guidelines, laws, and policies used by individual combative sports regulatory bodies. I was talking with Dr. Taylor earlier, and I sometimes use the analogy of an IT director's attempt to guard against computer viruses. As soon as you feel you get the handle on one situation, another pops up. It's a new masking agent, a new performance-enhancing drug. It's almost like a whack-a-mole thing. You're trying to rope them all in. In the international sports world, the World Anti-Doping Agency, known as WADA, is recognized as an industry standard for testing methods as well as testing content. For example, which drugs are prohibited out of competition and in competition, as well as what their associated positive thresholds are. In the United States, we have an arm of WADA called United States Anti-Doping Agency, or known as USADA. One of the other major players is VADA, which is a voluntary anti-doping association. It's U.S.-based as well, and they facilitate voluntary enrollment into their program, not only testing but counseling. And that program is designed and used currently for the sports of MMA and boxing in the United States. These organizations use WADA-approved labs, two of which are located in the U.S., one at Salt Lake City, Utah, and the other at UCLA in California. Our next speaker, Scott Smith with Austin Mobile Drug Testing, can explain some of the differences between WADA labs and other popular labs, such as MedTox, which is what we use, and Redwood Toxicology, which is another very popular lab. Before I introduce Scott and bring him up, I'm also going to give you a rundown of our current TDLR drug testing procedures to kind of give you a baseline of where we're at. When we have an upcoming event come in where a promoter says, I'd like to hold an event on, let's say tomorrow in Houston or Humboldt, he sends this in 21 days in advance. we forward that information with the location and time of the event to Scott's folks at Austin Mobile Drug Testing. And Austin Mobile Drug Testing was used by request to test and was chosen because of the lower price for producing the same product and because of their ability to cover the entire state of Texas. When we call him with an event location, he'll be able to tell us, yep, I'll have someone there and we'll take care of you. And so that's how, I would have to ask you, I've been here 3 years and you've been doing it that long. How long have you been the main tester, roughly?
For TDLR?
Yeah.
Just about that long.
Okay.
I started right before
Jim, hold on, I'm sorry. Mary Winston, TDLR. For those watching, they can't hear him. So
Okay.
we can invite him up.
Very good.
And we can hear him, but we don't want the public. to
Thank you,
see.
Mary. Come on up, Scott. We got to share this for now.
And so I started, I would say it was about 3 or so years ago, when Jerry had reached out to us regarding that. So it was about, I'd say, 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you, Scott. Combative Sports program gathers and finalizes the name of the event participants because that changes. The first notice we get, we may have 10 bouts with 20 fighters, and by the time we get to the event, 5 or 6 or 7 of those might have switched out with new people. So once the names are gathered and finalized, we pair them by bout. We don't test just one opponent, we test both opponents, whoever's fighting each other. And we forward that information to AMDT along with the names of the title bout participants. If we have a title bout, state title, world boxing title, MMA title, they are automatically drug tested. If there are no title bouts, we do a minimum of 3 bouts, which is 6 contestants. We send those names to a TDR employee outside the Combative Sports program for randomization. So they put those bouts in a computer and it kicks out the order. Now, even if there's a title bout, if you had 3 title bouts, that's 6 people, we would still do that list because if something happens to one of those participants in a title bout and he can't fight, didn't pass his physical, didn't make weight, now we rotate down to the next person on the list. So we always keep that list current so that if something does happen between the time we notify Scott and the time that his tester shows up, we have the correct information. Drug test consent forms are signed by the participants during a weigh-in ceremony. AMDT confirms arrival time and name of their sample collector. I call him a sample collector. Is there a better name? Okay, sample collector. AMT sample collector arrives at the event site and confirms the participants, again, in case there's been any last-minute changes on who's being tested. And they collect samples in the presence of a TDLR employee and or a contract inspector. AMDT sample collector submits a chain of custody form to the lead inspector after completion of the sample collection. So before we turn him loose, he'll come in and a lot of times he's there an hour, he's done with all the drug tests, but before he leaves, he gives us a copy of the chain of command for each one of them so that we have that information as we wait for the drug test results. Drug test results are forwarded from Scott's group at AMDT to TDLR. We review them. Complaints are filed with TDLR enforcement to address any positive test results. We in TDLR can issue an automatic 90-day mandatory suspension to the licensee. So if that boxer or MMA contestant shows positive on his test, we can put that mandatory 90-day suspension into play, but the folks with enforcement handle any monetary or revocation actions to be taken against the licensee. So it's a due process that goes through, but we can keep them idle for that first 90 days. Random selection documentation, chain of custody forms, test results, and copies of any associated complaints are filed in the event folder. So that's how we close everything out. We get a copy of the complaint, all of our documents that we've had the contestant sign, and chain of custody, all that, and that goes into a folder that's kept in our files. So that's our current process. If there's any questions, we can either do them now or at the end when Scott's done. Dr. Schramm.
You're discussing in-competition testing. Could you mention or give us your experience with out-of-competition testing as well?
Sure. Currently, Texas does not do out-of-competition testing. You can schedule it with Water. You can schedule it with Scott. but we don't have it written into our rules yet. And the reason for out-of-competition testing is if you have a big event, big by big I mean a high focus, high popular, or monetary-wise big event, those boxers or MMA folks might be, we want to make sure they're, not we, the folks that test for out-of-competition want to make sure that they're not taking advantage of a PED and then cutting off right before the competition. So they may have been on some type of a hormone or steroid for 3 months, and then the cycle time before the fight, 2 weeks or whatever, they quit using it. So they're not going to test positive during the event, but they have reaped benefits of taking that drug because it's built muscle or whatever. So that's why they do out of competition, and that's why you'll see sometimes they'll catch someone with an out of competition positive drug test for cocaine or something that is not performance enhancing, so then they have to go, excuse me, go and decide, is that something that we're going to keep them from fighting because they didn't do it in competition, so, but if it's a performance enhancing drug, or like our friend Canelo Alvarez just tested for clenbuterol, he's got a suspension because of that. It was out of competition, but it was unfair to his opponent. So that's where we're at with out of competition. Good question, though. Thank you.
Any other questions?
No,
Okay.
I have two quick questions.
Yes, sir.
First, for the non-bout testing, who pays? Is that covered by the state, or is that covered by the fighter?
The promoter pays for the drug testing. He is allowed to recover some or all of those costs from the fighter.
Okay. And then the second question, when you listed the chain of command, is there any MD signature on the chain of custody in terms of observation on the urine collection specimen? So it's strictly between the lab and the fighter?
It's between the lab and then one of our, either myself or one of the other supervisors and or an inspector, one of our inspectors.
So the ringside physician has no participation in that?
Not at this time.
chain? Okay. No other questions?
Go ahead, sir.
And the in-bout drug testing, when is it done?
It's done the day of the bout prior to them entering the ring.
Do we as physicians get any report on that?
Not currently. What we do is the promoter makes the contractual agreement with Scott's company, so that promoter has made that agreement, he gets the results, and then we get them to review. But other than that, we don't have, those results aren't released upon receiving unless there's an open records request currently.
Are we doing that now,
What's that, the testing?
the testing?
Yeah.
Because I haven't seen it.
Oh, yeah, we do it at every event.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
In Laredo, with that Mayorga fight
Dr. G?
2 weeks ago? A week ago?
Dr. G, just again, so we can catch all this, as you're getting comfortable, you're moving back.
Oh.
So let's make sure everyone else can share. Thank
And
you.
then please identify who you are when you're
Okay.
speaking.
Thank you, Doctor.
Manuel Gonzalez, I just want to know, because I haven't seen that happening when I'm.
Oh, absolutely. And we can stop up the office and let you know who the supervisor was, but
Okay.
yeah. Well, Scott, you could probably tell me,
Was done in Laredo.
yeah. Because Scott handles every
Okay.
city that we go to, he assigns someone.
Because I haven't seen it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we do it usually as soon as they get there, because a lot of them,
Oh, okay.
I gotta go to the bathroom, so we try to take care of them as soon as we can. Good questions. Anyone else?
Yes, I did. I think you just answered to Chris Reed. You did say we do them every event now.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Wayne Lee, last question, and then
Yes.
we can move on. Is there any data in terms of pre versus post-bout collection? So meaning doing the collection before they do the actual fight versus doing a collection at the end of the match?
We don't have any, but what we, kind of the thought process we have is that once they get to the arena, we're pretty much sequestered them. They can't leave and go, even if they go to the restroom, we send an inspector with them. So we can't 100% guarantee that there's not some ingestion done during the fight, but we have eyes on their equipment that they take up to the corner, any liquids that come into the restroom, or I'm sorry, into the locker room. So we don't do post-bout now, we just do pre-bout. Now, if we have a large group like UFC come in, or independent testing, or if the contestant was registered with VADA, then they might do some testing of their own post-bout. We've even had UFC do blood draws after the bouts.
Just a follow-up question.
Sir.
Dr. Schramm, the state of Texas does not do out-of-competition testing, so I'm assuming, well, two questions actually. How many states do, and do we leave the out-of-competition testing to the various combative sports groups, like, say, UFC or WBC or
Yeah.
something like that?
We'll cover it during the work group reports, but I've got a little bit of a breakdown on some of the major states and what they do. There aren't a lot that do out-of-competition testing. There aren't a lot of states that can sit down and tell you what their THC level threshold is. It just, if there's not a lot of focus and a lot of events, it's something that kind of gets brushed off to the side.
Okay. If no other questions, thank you so much for your presentation. I think next on the B portion of under C, we have drug testing procedures by Mr. Scott Smith from Austin Mobile Drug Testing.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name's Scott Smith with Austin Mobile Drug Testing. I'm just going to kind of give you a rundown of the procedures, basically from start to finish where I'm at, and then some other things about the WADA approved labs opposed to the current labs we're using right now. Start to finish, Jim pretty much covered majority of the things I was going to go over. And so, yeah, from rundown, I get a list of these are all the fights that are going on in Texas. Then I will contract out what area that they are in to get a collector in that area for a reasonable price. That's not going to scare the promoters and get them all angry. Once all that's done, we show up to the event. Pre-fight, normally it's about a couple hours before the event, the first bout. All the fights are observed. There's normally a female with the TDLR available if there's not a female collector for the female fighters to observe the test. And then there's always a TDLR inspector that's along with the collector in the restroom doing the observation as well to make sure that nothing really happens, and that way TDLR knows that the collector wasn't in on it or anything like that as well. If the fighter can't go pre-bout, then we do let them fight, and then we will do the test after the bout. We'll make them, and if in that case, the collector will stay with them if they're wandering around trying to take pictures, if they won or whatnot, to make sure that they're not doing anything that they're supposed to or trying to get a substituted specimen or anything like that. So, and then we'll do the drug test at that point. After the fight, I immediately put everything, all the specimens, and I mandate that the collectors do as well. If it's a weekend fight, that they're refrigerated till the Monday till we can ship them out. They are overnighted to the lab. Currently, we use MedTox. I used to use Redwood, but I was having an issue with some of their specimen cups. They were leaking, and in the 10 years I've been doing this, I haven't had as many issues with the leakage problem as I did with them. So we started using MedTox. Haven't had any issues with that. It goes to the lab. It takes about a couple days. Drug screens can take normally about a week, about 5 business days. The steroid tests take around about up to 2 weeks, about 10 business days is my average on those. I'll immediately get those, review them, shoot them right over to about 4 or 5 TDLR members, Jim, Greg, Vicky, Gus, and then and Linda gets one as well. And then the promoter gets a copy along with that. I leave everything up to them. If there are some issues regarding, let's say, a pH level or a low creatinine and specific gravity, I'll provide my recommendation or my 2 cents on, how they should treat it. If the pH is way out of whack, obviously there could be some issue there. But if it's just minimal by like a decimal, it could just be like a little bit of bacteria that happened to cause that pH level. If it was, sometimes if they can't urinate right away, they'll go on and fight. Now they're drinking some water. Sometimes that can cause the specimen to dilute itself, the lab will call it as an inconclusive test. So depending on the level of that dilution, if it's extremely diluted, I'll recommend, they possibly maybe tried flushing their system out or, purposely drank too much water. If it was, right below it, say the cutoff for creatinine's got to be greater than 20. If it's at a 19, I can honestly say they probably didn't purposely drink a whole bunch of water to try to flush some system out. So I'll provide those recommendations to the TDLR if I see something like that on one of the results. That's pretty much the start and finish process. As for me getting the information on the fight, contracting it out, and collecting the specimens, sending it out to the lab, and reporting the results. As for when it comes to what we do is for boxing, they have us do a 10-panel drug screen is what we're currently doing. And for MMA, we do a drug and a steroid. And so I have proposed in the past that, and it's been brought up to my attention, it was a consideration to possibly use a WADA-accredited lab for some of these events. So I did reach out to a lab in Salt Lake City. It's called SMRTL, SMRTL, and Sports Medicine Research Lab or some testing laboratory. And they were on board and were very helpful, providing me some pricing and things like that if we wanted to move forward and provide WADA testing for some of these events. I think that's a great idea. As I was talking with the president at that lab, California and Nevada, they do certain WADA labs, not all of them, because some events aren't going to be that big, just like some of the pro events here just, aren't that huge. And so those ones, they'll just still use a standard SAMHSA-approved lab. But if it's like a world title or something like that, then they are using a WADA-accredited lab. But as I was talking with the president, he said, it would be a good thing for Texas to maybe think about possibly using a WADA-accredited lab for, just to stay consistent. And then the amount of testing that Texas has been doing this upcoming year as well, or this past year, is pretty on the high end of events that are being held per state. And so they could possibly, all the other states might in turn look at Texas as the standard. Texas went ahead and they want to do WADA labs on boxing, on MMA, whether it's a little fight or a big fight, they're consistent, the competitors will know, and so it could be a big thing. Right now, I was just talking earlier, in professional sports, you can have professional cheaters, and so they know, some of our testing right now currently in Texas is just standard. It's nothing crazy or anything. It is, our company focuses majority on federal drug testing for like federal motor carriers and pipeline and things like that, so we do drug testing on a federal level. But some of these labs, some of the panels that we're running are specific to a drug panel. And so some of these fighters, let's say some boxers, know what they're being tested for already and can probably try to avoid what they're doing. And so I would, I do suggest a WADA-accredited lab for the majority of the tests, just to kind of keep that consistency and let people know that this is what the state's doing, and I think it'd be a good idea. The difference pretty much between WADA is pretty extensive. I did have a little email. They can do a drug screen. I reached out because there had been some things they still kind of maybe want to keep drug testing to boxing, and unless it's a title fight, then we do drug and steroid. But if it's just a basic professional boxing fight, they'll just do a drug screen. The the president at the WADA lab in Salt Lake City did recommend, he said, if you just want to do a drug screen, he said they take a while and the test is a little pricey. And so he did recommend, possibly just sticking with the current SAMHSA approved lab for just basic drug screens, drugs of abuse. But as for steroids and things like that, the WADA panel is pretty extensive. A lot more than what my current MedTox one is. And so, that's what we would recommend. But he did still kind of recommend, you know, the SAMHSA-approved labs they're still great labs. They'll provide fast results and accurate results, and we can always customize them too if there's something that if you want me to add to it or something like that. So I think that's pretty much all I got. If you guys have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.
I have a few.
Okay.
This is Wayne Lee. Going back to the beginning with your protocol, do you have a written copy of the protocol that we have for the state?
I do not.
Okay. All right, so we'll go back and talk about that. And then the second thing in terms of on those offshoots on your protocol that you outline, particularly when you can't do a pre-bout testing. So is it the company's policy that you have someone that's personally bird dogging, using that expression, that fighter during that time period until they're able to collect? Or are they in their one area and the fighter is out and about until they're able to give a specimen?
So what happens if, let's say there's 6 people to be tested, we're going in, 3 of them are ready to go right away, so we get them done. A couple of them aren't ready to go yet. Let's just say the first person I get with isn't ready, so I'll go to the next fighter. That current fighter will have an inspector with him as he's getting wrapped up or whatever, and so he will be watched. The collector will not be witnessing him. Now, after the fight, normally we've had drug testing, they'll be finished. We're just waiting on this one person, and then he has to go fight, and then he comes back. So we're not really waiting on anything else but this person. So the collector is, you know, tailing him everywhere he goes and to make sure that nothing happens. And then at the same time, all the tests are done under direct observe, so we are still witnessing that it is coming from their body. The main reason to make sure that, to follow them even after the fight, to make sure that they're not ingesting something that they're not supposed to be doing.
Correct, and that's what I'm leading to. So that's also the reason it's important to have a protocol that covers that, because you have to list something that you're doing for those outliers.
Okay.
Are they sequestered? Who's specifically following them? Because now you have a breach in your chain of custody, because they were initially seen, now they're out, and unless someone is designated to follow them, there is a gap. So if it was being reviewed, then they can ask what happened to that fighter during that time period that they were denied because they couldn't avoid a specimen
Okay.
until they were able to come back.
That's something I could totally provide. From now on, I could put a list, and so if it does happen, the fighter has to get a post-bout fight, I can have a separate list that will have signatures, and so we can make sure that there is somebody assigned to this fighter, and make sure that, you know, the whole time they are being monitored, and then we will have a documentation that'll say that this person was being monitored the entire time.
Okay, well, that goes back to, again, about protocols so that TDLR can have a written statement again so that we can justify the procedures if it was ever questioned in terms of what our collection techniques are. And going back to the collection techniques again, in terms of once the lab result comes back, and you were giving some statements talking about abnormal variances, do you write a documentation with that particular lab saying that this is a variance based on this, and this is your opinion, and you sign off on it?
So what I'll do in most cases is I will contact the lab myself just to see if there were any abnormalities that, you know, that I would be able to constitute as most likely a positive test. Sometimes they'll say, you know, if the pH level was ridiculously out of whack, you know, they could say it was maybe they tried to use a blocker or drink something that threw it off, or like vinegar or something like that.
Right.
And so if it's nothing so I'll talk with the lab about it and get their kind of 2 cents. A lot of times they can't really legally tell me stuff, just because it's whatever the report's saying, and they can't really get into too many details because there's not 100% on what the issue was causing the pH, let's just say. But if it is let's say it's got to be between 4.5 and 8.9. So if it's like a 4.4, you know, they can pretty much honestly tell me that, you know, the lab report, unfortunately, is going to be inconclusive. It's going to say that they were unable to test for it because of a pH level. However, if anything was reported positive, they would report it positive, but they can't release a result that says negative because the pH was off.
Correct.
And so if it was positive, I'll still get a positive result. And so that's why I'll get with the lab and I'll try to see what the rundown was. Could this have been something serious, or is this, like I said, sometimes during the shipment, if it's, in a warehouse and it's 80 degrees in there or whatever, sometimes bacteria can grow in the urine and cause that pH indifference. And so if it's minimal like that, discussing with the lab, we can pretty much determine that it probably wasn't on purpose.
No, I understand.
And so I'll put that recommendation to TDLR. But no, I do not have anything writing from the
Right,
lab.
so that's the point that I'm getting at. If you were making a recommendation so that there is a change, there needs to be a documentation.
It's just an email is pretty much it is.
No, but
but
I'm
yeah.
saying there has to be, again, as far as your protocol is concerned, because there is a modification of the document from the lab. So
Okay.
you've discussed with them and you've agreed, the lab and yourself, based on your professional background, that there is a difference and that you can write this off based on bacterial overgrowth or this. So you're saying that this is an accepted positive or an accepted negative.
Okay.
But there needs to be a note saying, this person, I've discussed this, and I, under my opinion, agree that this is da-da-da-da-da, signed off on that date. Because again, we're talking about chain of custody, because someone can then go back and refute that because they'll say, well, who made this determination on the specimen?
Okay.
And then I had one more thing before I was done. We were talking about testing. Okay, go ahead.
Scott, you mentioned, you discussed some testing with a water lab. Was it Salt Lake?
Myrtle, yeah, Salt Lake
Smyrtle.
City.
And you said that their steroid testing was quite extensive. I'm assuming that also means expensive. Can you give us just and this would be more, I guess promoters pay for these tests, correct?
Yeah, so
What sort of difference are we talking about between, say, MedTox and WADA?
currently I'm billing them $87 for a steroid test.
MedTox.
Yep, using MedTox. And it's $37 for a drug screen is what I'm charging them. For a in-competition WADA panel will include drugs and steroids. This was my price from the lab was $200. So I'd mark it up like $225 or something.
Sorry to interrupt, but because some of this, when we're talking about pricing and stuff like that, some of that may be bidding and those kinds of things in terms of that. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is what he's really asking is what is in the WADA panel in terms of steroid testing that they're testing for versus what you're testing for in your particular panel.
Okay.
And based on that, are those steroids that they're testing for something that we need on routine bouts versus something for a title bout?
Okay.
Well, I really was interested.
You want in the pricing?
In pricing.
I can go over that
because
later
it's,
if you want.
You have to sort of take into consideration a burden on the promoters if you're, I wanted an idea of what the difference would be.
It's about $120 more
Yeah.
than what
Okay.
they're currently paying. And that was a quote that I got based on an amount of tests that we were going to be doing based on January,
Volume.
February, and March. Those were pretty
So it's
crazy
a
months.
volume pricing.
And I'd assume it wouldn't be too far. Jim had sent me some stuff regarding California and their agreement with the UCLA lab. And they had an agreement that it was $50,000 a year or however much it was that they were going to at least pay into. It could be more, but at minimum they were at least going to cover like $50,000 a year. I can't remember exactly what it was, but that's how California had their agreement. I kind of reached out and said, so far, based on January, February, and March, this is how many we've been doing, about 10 events. That's 60 people a month. I was like, just average in it at this rate, what kind of price can you give me? And that's the price that I got. I do recommend if it is pricier with some of these promoters, because, like I said, I believe the consistency across the board would be a great thing. If maybe there was an issue or a way for the state to maybe assist in the promoters for some of them. I know some of the fights aren't going to be too crazy big and whatnot, but if it is an issue for the promoters and some of these fighters who are only making a couple $100 and then to take $200 away from them, I didn't know if that was something that could be addressed, but that could always be an issue. As for the things that are different with the WADA lab, they are testing for their steroid-wise. I'm only doing an anabolic steroids right now for MedTox. So the WADA panel is like 300. It's crazy how many different things are in here. But they do an antibiotic steroid. They'll do the beta agents. They do diuretics. And then they do their narcotics and cannabinoids and stimulants. So we're not really doing stimulants. The only stimulants we're really testing for is in the drug panel, because we're doing anabolic steroids. And then you have stimulants like Sudafed and ephedrine and things like that we're not doing in the drug screen. We're doing amphetamines and methamphetamines and cocaine. Those are pretty much the only stimulants in a drug panel that we're currently doing. So it's just a far more extensive panel than what's currently being offered. When I took over, I got what Request a Test was doing, and I just basically copied it over, and we've been doing an anabolic, because that's what they were doing, an anabolic steroid test and a 10-panel drug screen. There were a couple things on their drug panel that we had talked with and decided that there wasn't a huge deal, because like methaqualone, actually that's on mine, but there was one that was on there. It's not a big deal. It's not normally taken, so we agreed that it didn't need to be on the panel. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what it was, but it was basically like an outdated drug that pretty much doesn't exist anymore. So that's pretty much the difference between the WADA lab. I tried to get, and I apologize, I wanted to get some stuff on their drug panel. I sent the guy like 4 emails and I never heard back regarding their drugs of abuse. I wanted to get the whole rundown on what drugs they have, because on the WADA thing I could only pull up was just a couple things. As for their cutoff levels and things like that, it was only like 10 different stuff, but I wasn't getting, cocaine wasn't in there, and amphetamine. And so I reached out to the president asking if he could provide me of a list with cutoffs and things like that, and I have yet to get anything back, but as soon as I do, I'll make sure I shoot that over to you guys for review. But the drug panel is going to be a little more extensive as well, if doing a WADA lab, just because they're following the WADA rules and regulations, which is an extensive prohibited list. With ours, we're doing 10 drugs, and I think on my steroids, we've got like 20 steroids that we're testing for. So the WADA lab is just a lot more extensive. So not too much more expensive, but just a lot more
Any other
extensive.
questions?
I have a question, Manuel Gonzalez. Are you testing amateurs?
No, not currently, unless they request it, but we haven't.
Any other questions?
Chris Reed, who or how do we determine what substances are tested on what sports?
That's up to you guys. I just kind of, you provide me with what you want and I'll get it done. If there's something you need to customize or if you need to add something, you guys just let me know and we can do that.
Is that the same on thresholds? What thresholds we?
So currently, they're on like a national threshold level. So
Okay.
just if they follow the federal guideline, marijuana right now is at 50 nanograms. WADA is at 150. So I think the WADA is slightly different, and right now we're just at the current national standard. WADA actually, I just looked into some of their stuff. We measure on nanograms per milliliter. They measure on micrograms per milliliter, which is 1,000 nanograms. So
Wayne Lee, if there are no other questions, can you provide us a list of what you have been to date, since you've been doing this for 3 years, what you're presently testing for the state in terms of?
oh yeah, I have a
Do you have it so that we can get a copy for the board members?
somewhere around here.
I think I've shared some actual results with y'all, so it should be listed on there, but we can sure get you more
Okay.
too.
All right.
Yeah, you got that?
Any other questions?
I just had one comment, if I could get Scott to explain the different testing methods with isotope compared to the gas.
Okay. And then there was an issue with the UFC event last year where they had tested positive for, or it wasn't positive, their testosterone to epitestosterone ratio was elevated. Normal is about a 4-to-1, testosterone to epitestosterone. And there was a female who had a higher testosterone ratio, and it was brought to my attention that in order to determine whether it's endogenous testosterone, that you have to perform an isotope ratio mass spectrometry test. They call it an ERMS, IRMS. So I just literally learned about that last year during that whole thing. And so that's different. That is done at a water lab. I haven't ever checked into MedTalks to see if that was something that they can provide, but I'm sure it's a possibility. So what that determines is, yeah, if somebody's actually taking a testosterone that's not natural, or if their body is producing the natural testosterone. And that's what that IRMS test determined, was that it was natural. And that, I think part of the case was that there was a birth control, contraceptive that they were taking that was producing these levels of, I don't know if it was lowering the epitestosterone or if it was higher.
Mary Winston, okay, so we're gonna just, thank you.
No problem.
That's enough information on that one. We'll just keep it moving. from
Okay,
Thank you very much.
no problem, guys.
Next on the list, we have an overview of concussion. Dr. Taylor, are you doing everything for this, or is it staff presentation before?
I don't know. I know I'm doing this part, PowerPoint.
Is there a pre-presentation?
I'll
before?
do that for you. You
Okay,
bet.
go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Our next topic, concussion testing, has also evolved over the years. Technology has added many tools for our medical professionals to use when diagnosing concussion. Those tools, along with the vast knowledge our ringside physicians possess, are used to evaluate our athletes. Progress has been made in detecting pre-existing concussive head injuries, as well as evaluating the athlete immediately post-bout. Again, as with drug testing, processes related to concussion testing vary widely from athletic commission to athletic commission. Rundown of what we currently, some of the bullet points that we have in TDLR. Combative Sports program has a minimum rest period suspension for a technical knockout, which is 30 days, and a knockout, which is 60 days. Those are the minimums. Although these are minimums, we rely heavily on the ringside physician's input when issuing the final rest period or suspension, which may include an extended time away from competing and additional testing, as recommended by the physicians. And additional testing might be MRI, CT scan, neuro. Any suspension issued by a regulatory agency such as TDLR, Combative Sports, is entered into a national database. For boxing, it's Fight Facts. For MMA, there's MMA.com that tracks the suspensions of all fighters. This database can be accessed by any regulatory body in the world, and reciprocity of medical suspensions issued by regulating bodies for boxers in the U.S. are mandated by federal law. So if a fighter fights in Pennsylvania this weekend and gets suspended for 60 or 90 days because of a knockout, that suspension goes on that national database. If he tries to come down here a week later or 2 weeks later and fight here, we get the suspension list, review it, he's on there. We, by federal law, are bound to uphold that suspension. It has not yet moved over into the MMA side. There's some proponents of that they would like to do it. It's not mandated by federal law, but we follow that reciprocity. If there's a MMA fighter that's been knocked out and he's on a suspension list, then we respect that suspension. Combative Sports staff checks the suspension list for boxing and MMA prior to approving any bout. So a promoter will send us a list and say, I want to have fighter A up against fighter B. One of the first things we do is we make them, if it's a boxing event, we make them send us their Fight Facts records so we can look at the bottom of the record, and you ringside physicians are familiar with those. We furnish them to you at ringside during a fight. And if there's something on there, we tell a promoter, he can't fight until this suspension is lifted, whether it's our suspension or one from a different jurisdiction. And the same with MMA. We go in, enter their name into that database, and if a suspension pops up, we let the promoter know, no go until that suspension is lifted. We also review their past suspensions. If you see someone that's been in for a eye problem, he's been suspended 3 or 4 times for eye problem follow-up, we may ask for a little more testing, which is in our rules that we can ask for additional testing to make sure that there's not a problem with his eyes. Or if he's had several knockouts in a row or something like that, we can use that information of previous suspensions to also make decisions. When applying for a license, athletes must have passed a comprehensive physical exam, which includes a battery of neurological tests, within 6 months of their application date. And the last bullet point, when we were talking about pre-existing issues, of any athletes 36 years of age or older must also submit a normal EEG. So that's where we're at. And again, we can, when we do our work group reports, there was some documents I shared with you, and we can kind of go back and see what some of the other states do for that. So at this point, I'd like to bring up Dr. Randolph Taylor from Houston for his presentation.
Thank you, Jim. So this is going to be basically, we can kind of go to the monitor, an education, brief update on concussion, because we've all either heard about concussions or either experienced some of these concussions during our youth and sport activity. But since that time, a lot of things have changed. I have nothing to disclose financially. So we're going to go over the epidemiology, pathophys, signs and symptoms, concussion eval tools, neuroimaging, management, legislation, prevention, complications. I'll try not to bore you guys. So let's go through some basic questions real quick that we should all ask ourselves. So which of the following is correct? So A through D, and we'll go through them real quick, and you don't have to raise your hands, and we'll go through some answers hopefully at the end of the presentation. So grade 1 concussion is considered a mild concussion. That's option A. Option B is grade 2 is considered a moderate concussion. Option C is grade 3 is a severe concussion. And then option D is none of the above are correct because the grading method is no longer used for diagnosing concussion. So ask yourselves which one of these answers are correct. Next question. CT and MRI are the tools of choice for diagnosing a concussion. True or false? Again, ask yourself this question. Once diagnosed with a concussion, an athlete can return to play. Option A, immediately after resting for 15 minutes. Option B, if there was no loss of consciousness. Option C, after reinforcing the helmet with air and changing mouthpieces. And a lot of these things, concussion became a big deal, directly related to football and NFL. There's no return. Option D is there is no return to play in the same game after diagnosing with a concussion. And some of these questions do not directly correlate with combative sports themselves, such as MMA, because it's not a team event, it is an individual competition. But these are some of the basic questions we have to ask ourselves. Are these actually still correct during our time? So the CDC talked about how many concussions or TBIs. So a TBI is a traumatic brain injury. A MTBI is considered a concussion. So TBIs can be brain bleeds, they can be fractures of the skull. All those are considered TBIs. A concussion is considered an MTBI. So if you see that nomenclature later. So more epidemiology about the most common percentage of concussions that present to the ER. And as you can see at the bottom, football, large amount of presentations of concussions. And then girls soccer is number 2. So concussion, by definition, a concussion or mild traumatic brain injury, MTBI, is a pathophysiological process affecting the brain. There may or may not be loss of consciousness. A concussion is an acute injury reflecting an alteration of brain function. So it's not actually damage, a structural damage to the brain. It's more of a injury to the function of the brain, i.e. the electrolytes that go into a part of the thought process. So now we're going to talk about what we call sports-related concussions. So in sports, we look at concussions from a different perspective versus car accidents or somebody falling off a building. So a sports-related concussion, SRC is the new terminology, is a TBI induced by biomechanical forces. So those forces do not always have to be direct blow to the head. Back in the day, we always thought you had to get hit in the head to have a concussion. That's not actually the case. Caused by a direct blow to the head, face, neck, or elsewhere on the body with enough force that transmits to the head. So you can hit directly in the chest, but if that force transmits to the head, it can cause an electrolyte abnormality leading to a concussion. Because like I stated earlier, concussion is not structural damage, but functional damage. So this is kind of the breakdown of some of the science, as we all remember chemistry class here. So glutamate, calcium, potassium, those are all in the brain, intra and extracellular. What happens is when you have a concussion, there's a decrease in blood flow to the brain, but the brain needs more glucose to start thinking. But because of the decreased blood flow, glucose doesn't actually get to the brain, and this causes a mismatch in supply and demand. So this is an axon. So these are nerves in the brain, and it's a cartoon about which way potassium comes out, sodium comes in. So this busy slide here basically breaks down where the electrolytes are going. So potassium's coming out 4 times what is normal. Glucose is coming up 2 times during the first 20 minutes after the injury. Blood flow to the brain decreases by 20%. The energy requirement increases, but as I stated earlier, the blood flow decreases, and lactic acid forms in the brain. And we all know when we run, we exercise, the next day we have pain in our thighs and our legs. This is secondary to the lactic acid buildup. So in a concussion, this lactic acid is built up and leads to decrease and slowing the thought process. So there's another cartoon, looks at time and then amount. And these are your electrolytes. So as you can see, the electrolytes post-concussion, immediately after concussion, everything goes up. It takes about 7 to 14 days for the electrolytes to get back to normal, i.e., normally an average sports-related concussion resolves in about 7 to 14 days, and that can be directly correlated with this graph. So in the past, a lot of smart individuals came up with guidelines and classifications of concussions. So there is no more grading of concussion. So there is no grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3 of concussions. A concussion is a concussion, is a concussion, is a concussion. It doesn't matter. We're no longer grading them based on how long you were out or how severe the injury appeared to be. So again, a lot of smart people got together and they formed this consensus statement. So consensus statement on concussions in sport, and notice how this is directly related to sport, and it was done by the International Conference on Concussion in Sport held in Berlin in 2016. I also want you guys to take a look at the arrow. This is the 5th International Conference on Concussion. So we could probably expect there to be a 6 and a 7 as more knowledge comes about. So basically, in summary, the concussion says concussions can be caused by a direct blow to the head, face, neck, or elsewhere. Concussion usually results in the rapid onset of short-lived impairment of neurological function, again, not structure, that resolves spontaneously. There are cases where symptoms and signs may evolve over minutes to hours. So just because you got a big hit, you may not immediately show signs and symptoms of concussion. It may develop over a period of time. The SCAT is a sports concussion assessment tool. This is what they came about. It's a paper tool that's used to measure the symptoms that are directly related to concussion. The American Academy of Neurology, they pretty much piggybacked on the consensus statement, and they added athlete is not allowed to return to play until evaluation and assessment by a licensed healthcare provider with training in both diagnosis of management and concussion. So basically, this is saying once an athlete has a concussion, technically they should be suspended until they're evaluated by a licensed healthcare provider saying that they're cleared of those concussive symptoms before they can return to play. So these are basically some signs and symptoms of concussion. So headache, nausea, vomiting, change in balance, the foggy memory, difficulty concentrating, irritability, decreased sleep, increased sleep, difficulty falling asleep. So where are we evaluating concussions? So we're evaluating concussions at the ringside, at the sideline, and we're also evaluating concussions in our office and in the emergency room. So ringside is done by a physician at the ringside or done by an athletic trainer. We can do serial monitoring. A lot of times in boxing, these evaluations for concussion are done post-bout, not necessarily during the bout. Because in boxing and combative sports, the purpose of the sport is to enable your opponent per rules and guidelines of the sport. So there's a quick evaluation that can be done that they're doing in some sports and that we kind of do in boxing and MMA. The Maddox question. So, for example, a combatant is knocked out in the ring. He has a brief loss of consciousness. The physician goes into the ring, and we ask the fighter some basic questions, such as what round is it that you were hit in? Who is your opponent? What did he hit you with? How are you doing during the bout? Who did you fight last week or 2 months ago? And this is similar to what we do on the sideline in football. This is called the best evaluation. So this is looking at the patient's function as far as being able to stance. So there's a best test where they stand inside a box, and they should not be wobbly. They should be able to stand still for a certain amount of time. This is the SCAT. This is a tool that's used by a lot of athletic trainers in the training room for a lot of our group sports, such as boxing, basketball, baseball, and soccer. So basically the question is, does every concussion need to be scanned? So notice at the beginning of the talk I said a concussion is not a structural issue, it is a functional issue. So based on that knowledge, there's no requirement that a concussion has a CT or MRI. Now, in our sport, we may recommend a CT or MRI, not for a concussion, but for the risk of possible bleeding in the brain. So that's why we will send patients to the hospital for a CT or MRI, because we're worried about this fighter having some direct neurological damage, structural damage to the brain due to the combative sport. So this is kind of some of the guidelines. When a patient walks into an ER, if they fit any of this criteria, there's a high likelihood that the ER physician is going to do a CT of their head. Because based on the American College of Emergency Physicians, these are the guidelines to eval a patient for a brain bleed, not for a concussion. So, future, going forward, there are studies to look at a functional MRI, where the athlete is actually moving and doing certain tasks in the MRI. And notice, what they're looking for isn't bleeding of the brain to evaluate concussions. They're looking for changes in oxygen and blood flow in the brain. Again, functional status. There's a diffusion tensor imaging, DTI. Again, is looking at the function of the brain and not structural damage. And then there's MR spectroscopy. Again, looking at proteins in the brain, not exactly at the structure. So concussion testing. So we have neuropsych testing in majority of our major sports, such as football, baseball, soccer, hockey. And it's broken down in two forms. So majority of these neuropsych testings are computerized testing that are done before the actual sporting event. So during the off season, the athlete will undergo a computerized test. One of the pros of these tests, they can be done pre-bout or pre-event, and then the test should be able to be done second post-evaluation, or if you're concerned about a concussion or you've diagnosed the athlete with a concussion, you should be able to repeat the test. The test usually evaluates attention span, memory, speed of thinking, and reaction time. There's some additional testing, and we're going to go through, that talks about balance, eye speed, and reaction time. So some caveats to neuropsych testing. So there's a multidisciplinary approach to managing concussions. Concussions should be diagnosed clinically. We should not have a tool to say this patient has a concussion. It's a clinical diagnosis made by the healthcare provider. The neuropsych testing is to assist the provider in helping them identify when the athlete can return to play. There's no complete standard saying you have to have neuropsych testing in your concussion program. However, most of the major sports are moving that way. So these are a list of some of the most common neuropsych testings that are on the market right now. So we have the automated neuropsychological assessment metrics. This is used in the military. This is done pre and post deployment, so that before the soldier would deploy, they would take an ANAM, and then post deployment, when they returned, all the post soldiers would take an ANAM. This would help determine their speed, mental speed pre and post deployment, to see if it had changed, if they had experienced any type of IED or explosive event. You have the COG state, the head minor. Another very popular neuropsych testing is the immediate post-concussive assessment and cognitive test, also known as IMPACT. Then we have the King-Devick testing, and most recently we have the C3 logic, which measures balance and oculomotor. And currently being studied is the iGuide focus. So this is C3 logic. So basically it's an iPad that's attached to the athlete's back, and it measures the time and ability to be in a best test, like I showed you guys earlier, basically. And it also tests for the time and speed and reaction time, similar to other testing agents. Next is IMPACT. The difference is this does not test the balance portion or the eye portion. When it does test the eye portion based on reaction time, this again is the most common test being used by the major sporting groups. It's also being used in a lot of high school sports, like high school football. This is the King-Devick test. This is another test that evaluates eye movement and speed. So this is an example. You read the numbers across pre-event, before you have a concussion, and then if you have a concussion, you come back and you read the numbers again, and your time on both sides to see if there's a change. This is the iGuide focus. This is currently being used most recently in New Jersey, where the fighter pre-fight looks and follows a dot, and as the dot moves, as I mess with you guys, follow the dot, right? So follow the dot. So it follows a dot, and it makes a circle, as you can see. The blue is normal. That's pre-fight. The green, in this particular fighter, is post-fight, and you can see the changes. Now, if you look at the other slide, the blue was pre-fight. The red was post-fight. And this fighter, based on the literature on the website, this fighter with the change actually won the fight. So current states and what they're doing. So California and Nevada have adapted the C3 logic. So every athlete in Nevada and California, before they can receive a license, has to undergo this C3 logic testing. And this is basically a cutout from their website at their meeting, similar to ours, talking about the requirements for the concussion testing. In their legislation document, it also talked about the financials, how much they paid, and things of that nature. New Jersey, most recently, was the test site for the iGuide focus. So those particular personnel came to New Jersey, and they've been testing the equipment out on those fighters. So There's also been future studies on blood markers to identify concussions, and it's amazing how fast the future catches up with us. So most recently, they have identified blood markers to determine if there's blood in the brain. So these tests, the media says that these tests help determine if a CT scan needs to be done on someone who has a concussion. The levels can be elevated within 15 to 20 minutes of injury. The test's done within 12 hours of injury, and the results can be obtained within 3 hours. The problem is, a concussion is not a structural issue. It's a functional issue. And I've talked to a lot of my ER doctors. None of them, if they thought a patient had a brain bleed, would wait till this blood test came back, because they're looking for blood in the brain. So this really doesn't really help us as sports-related concussion evaluation. So treatment. So the first 24 hours is Tylenol or acetaminophen, because we are worried about that possibility of brain bleed. And then 48 hours later, we treat with anti-inflammatories, and then we treat with sleep aids, because as you guys saw earlier, one of the issues was decreased ability to sleep. The most common sleep aid we're using now is something basic such as melatonin, because it limits the side effects. So legislation, return to school and return to play protocol. So there's a lot of legislation right now. So in 2009, the Zachary Lysett law was passed, and now 50 states and the District of Columbia have passed laws on concussion in sports for youth and or high school athletics. The legislation is pretty intense. 3 principles to the law. 1, concussion education for coaches, athletes, and parents and guardians. And that's also shown in the CDC website. TDRL has information on concussions on their website as well. There's removal from play at the time of suspected injury. Again, very difficult in our sport. Clearance by a healthcare provider trained in concussion management to clear for return to play. In this document, anybody, coach, ref, promoter, can say, hey, this patient may have a concussion, but only a physician can return the patient to play post-diagnosis of concussion. So suspected concussion, these are 24 states use the vocabulary of suspected concussion. So who should perform the sideline evaluation or the evaluation of a concussion? So in the state of Texas, it's required that a licensed physician performs evaluation of someone for a concussion. And in these other states, they say healthcare provider. Licensed healthcare provider trained in eval and the management of concussion. Once an athlete is removed, if no licensed healthcare provider, they cannot return that day. So what this is saying is, not everybody who gets a headache technically has a concussion. Like, not every fighter who got punched in the face, who has a headache, technically has a concussion. He could have just got punched in the face and has a headache. So the next step we're moving into is graduated return to play. So when can an athlete return to the field? So football, soccer, baseball, those sports have a graduated return to play. Combative sports, currently as it is, we do not have an agreed upon return to play protocol after that combatant has been identified as having a concussion. So the Association of Ringside Physicians has put together a consensus statement diagnosing and laying out a protocol of when a fighter can be returned to play, meaning when they can return to the gym, at what step can they return to hitting the heavy bag. So it's a stepwise approach, and you can go to their website and identify that. And this talks about the new return to play protocol. So just because a fighter has a headache doesn't mean they can't go outside. Back in the day, we would say, fighter has a concussion, stay inside, turn all the lights off, don't go anywhere. What that has led to is depression, anxiety. I don't want to tell anybody I have a concussion because I'm going to be stuck in my room all weekend. So we've gone past that, and now we allow athletes to ride the bike if they have concussion. Stationary bike, that is, not a regular bike, just in case they fall off. So it's a stationary bike. They may be able to lift weights, but do curls instead of doing bench press. So complications of concussions. So post-concussive syndrome, this lasts for about 10 to 14 days in adults and 4 weeks in kids. And basically, you have a prolonged symptoms of headache, dizziness, and fatigue. Lasts for weeks or months. Post-concussion syndrome is poorly understood. That's a lot of times where the neurologist gets involved. Second impact syndrome. If an athlete suffers a second concussion before completely recovering from the first, this may lead to brain swelling and then basically lead to brain death. This is very rare and most commonly occurs, if it does occur, in pediatric population. CTE, there's been a lot of media talk about CTE, which stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It is a progressive degenerative disease of the brain. CTE can only be diagnosed post-mortem. So we have, that's the only way you can diagnose someone with CTE. Not all athletes diagnosed with CTE, so post-mortem, not all those athletes who had CTE technically had concussion symptoms. Further research is needed to identify CTE and neurocognitive impairment. So retirement. So you see a lot of these football players very young in their career retiring from sport because they're concerned about CTE. Currently, there's no evidence, no guidelines about when someone should retire from a sport due to concerns about CTE. So in conclusion, look for concussions. When in doubt, thinking someone has a concussion, the goal is to hold them out. And every head does not need a CT scan for a concussion, but the head does need a CT scan for possible brain bleed. Follow return to sport guidelines, return to school guidelines and return to play guidelines. And let's follow, if possible, the guidelines the American Association of Ringside Physicians have set up for combative sports return to play. That's the summary. Any questions at all?
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. Any questions?
I do. Chris Reed, the EEG, or EAG, is it EEG?
EEG.
That we require,
Right.
that we require for those licensed applicants 35 and over, does that provide a big benefit to us, or is there a more reasonably priced test that we could do?
That's a great question. The EEG gives you a neurological baseline. The concern is, I believe, as you've been fighting at that, because you're, we said, over age 36, so you've probably been competing for a long period of time. So we don't have a baseline of what your brain function is like. So the EEG is just one more tool to help establish that baseline. I've talked about to some of my neurologists, and they ask the question, why are we getting an EEG? They ask the question, why aren't we getting an MRI to look at the brain structure? So that's very debatable. Each state, the ABC, if you go through their state requirements, every state has something different, what they require neurologically.
And then one concern I have, and it's just mostly to put on our radar, is that, I think all the fighters understand that once they're suspended and they've had a head injury, they know that they can't fight for X amount of days. But one of my biggest concerns that I see is that, and I truly believe they don't understand it, is that they shouldn't be training, shouldn't be sparring, and a lot of them are. And so it may be just more of a, a PR thing that we figure out a way to educate them on.
You're exactly right, because that's why the Association of Ringside Physicians have put that in place, saying that, okay, you've been diagnosed with a concussion, here is your return to play guidelines for you, when you can start the heavy bag. So, yes, you can go back to training, but this is when you can go back to training, and this is how you go back to training.
If I may make a comment, Manuel Gonzalez, the question of EEG and that us as ringside physicians are encounters that any of us that have fought, when you get hit in the head, the first thing a lot of people say is, I see stars, I see lights. And that is because immediately when you get hit, you have a closed circuit of electrical potential, and immediately you have succinylcholine getting out of the cell, immediately. And you'll see the stars, and that's a good communication between the brain and the body, that you see the people fall, you see the people stagger. That's the first thing that happens. So with the time, as they get hit during the course of their fighting, this particular electrical shock origin, wherever it starts in the brain, it forms a scar. And then you start seeing different nituses of electrical potential shooting off. And that's why they brought the EEG in, because they don't give it to a guy that's only had one fight unless he got polluted. I mean, something terrible. But usually what happens is that with the time of your fights, your nituses of scarring occur in different parts of the brain. So you get different takeoffs of the shooting of the brain. The electricity is like different batteries. They should shoot off. And you see that on the EEG. That's why they do it in the older guys.
Gotcha.
You see what I mean?
Mhm, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. This has been an interesting topic. I'm sure that all of us have been educated and updated in terms of what we thought, and we'll go over it in some more detail when we get into open forum. Can we move next to the E category, which is overview of dehydration and weight cutting and concerns by TDLR staff? Jim, you're up again.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Our final topic, weight cutting and the often resulting dehydration, has become one of the most common and in some cases most dangerous problem in combative sports. Many athletes believe that they gain an advantage over their opponent by cutting weight to a predetermined or contracted weight, then gaining back 10 to 20% of their body weight. In the past, studies have shown that depending on how the weight cut was managed, there is no real advantage. Many athletes now consider a weight cut successful if they make weight at the scale, never mind what condition their body is in. Some don't understand that drinking large amounts of electrolytes and feasting on the latest fuel food is not bring their body back to peak mental or physical condition. They can put the weight back on, but it's not repairing what damage they have already done. I think I've shared the California 10-point plan system with you all. The plan consists of different facets of monitoring, regulating, and introducing consequences for drastic and or unhealthy weight cuts. So far, California is the only state that has adopted this and implemented it fully. Some regulatory bodies have adopted parts of the plan, but it has not been the sweeping revelation that it may have first appeared to be. You know, at first it came out and everybody said, this is great, and after more evaluation, again, some of it's been adopted, some of it hasn't. Whether or not we agree with or adopt some or all of the 10 points of California's plan, I think the important message is that we understand that the TDLR event supervisors and the ringside physicians conducting the pre-bout evaluation and monitoring the athletes at the event are the last lines of the defense against the dangers of severe weight loss and dehydration. No amount of laws, policies, or guidelines can force the athlete to present themselves in a properly hydrated condition at the weigh-in. We need effective, consistent, and documented processes in place to specifically address dehydration. We have Dr. Brown down in Houston was involved in an incident where an injury occurred that the athlete himself, no one else, the athlete himself attributed to a large weight loss. Dr. Brown now, in his pre-bout evaluations, asks additional questions. And in California, that's part of the 10-point system. How much weight did you lose for this fight? What period of time did you lose that weight? What's your normal weight? Some of those, he's trying to get them to be honest with him, and some of them may fudge, some may not. But at least he's going the extra step to ask those questions that are very relevant. It's something that I think, again, we don't have 24-hour, 7-day-a-week observation of these athletes, like a NCAA sport or anything like that. Sometimes the week of the card, we're not sure who all is going to be on that event, so we have no idea. Afterwards, we hear a lot of excuses that the fighter might say, well, I performed poorly because I lost. Do you know how much weight I lost? We don't know that. He may have, it might be the loser's limp when a defensive back gets burned, he comes back to the sideline, pull a hammy. No, you got beat. But in the cases that they are coming to the weigh-in and they are not properly hydrated, I think it would be a real good process or a good idea to establish a process that's consistent and specific to dehydration and defendable, so that if an injury does occur, you all and we all can say we did what we felt was best and we went by our processes, and that would be the end of it. So I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's input on the important issue. TDLR, combative sports, as a minimum rest period. Again, we were talking about the knockouts, and if the, okay, wait a minute, I got the wrong page here. Okay, so as far as dehydration, right now, it's right at the pre-bout physical. There's no pre-event weeks out or anything where it's clinical. Right now, it's in the field. So I think that's where we need to establish some guidelines and processes, is that you're the last person to see that athlete before they get into the ring or the cage, and that's where we need to act. And if it means canceling a fight, or telling that boxer or athlete, you know, you can't compete tonight. There's been some early weigh-ins. That has not, in my opinion, helped. We've seen a lot of the major UFC-type organizations that have had early weigh-ins that have had just, it seems, a plethora of bouts canceled because of problems with dehydration. And so does an athlete allow himself to tear himself down worse when he has 3 extra hours to build himself back up, in his mind? Later weigh-ins, then you run into the problem that if there is slight dehydration, you're not allowing them time to rehydrate. So again, a clinical assessment is not something that can fully be done in the field, but I think I'm confident that you all can have input to establish one that is workable.
Okay. Thank you very much. That moves us over to D, which is the open forum discussion on identifying best practices and recommendations for improving combative safety. And so we have A through C, and the A would be drug testing protocols, and input from TDLR in terms of how do we want to proceed in terms of that subsection.
Apologies. This is Colleen Tran, Assistant General Counsel. I think the focus of this agenda item is really for, and you guys kind of almost did it already when the presentations were going on. It's a discussion between everybody who's in this room, and specifically our board members, about if they have questions or if there are recommendations or thoughts on what is the best approaches for each one of those issues. We have taken some notes and questions as we went through already, but if there's anything additional that with the concussion discussion or with the weight cutting discussion that we would like to have as an open forum would be now.
Well, let's do it this way then. We were asking questions, as you stated, for the A through C in terms of drug testing, concussion testing, and dehydration. Going back to drug testing, does anyone on the panel have any additional questions or input? Yes, Dr. Taylor.
Dr. Taylor, I think I agree with the larger bouts, because I think finance is an issue, cost is an issue with the fighters, both at the almost like the minor league level that we have pro sports here, shows here. I think cost is an issue, so to me it makes sense to use our current vendors. But then when we get the larger fights, keep it a standard similar to our other states of using USADA or WADA-approved places for those bigger events, because they kind of do have the revenue to cover for the fighter. And at that point, they're truly professional, so they are going to they may be led to take other substances to improve their outcome. As far as the number of things that are tested, I think that's a tough call. I mean, that's a lot of substances that you named off, and I don't know where we draw the line about which ones we should and which ones we shouldn't. I do agree with kind of what Dr. Lee was saying earlier about if there's something not quite 100% normal, where the study is questionable, that there should be a process of saying, yes, it's not normal, and based on my expertise, I sign off that it's not normal. And my other question I did have was, what do we do with the ones that are too dilute to get a positive result or a negative result? Like, what happens to that individual?
So I think that one's been placed, that's on TDLR's call, whether they want to call that test positive or not. I think they do. If it's a dilute specimen, the lab suggests a recollection at that point. Obviously, we can't do a recollection because it's a week or two past the date. I believe You guys do call it positive, right?
We haven't, so.
Okay. So I guess it goes to their determination. If it's completely dilute and they suggest a recollection, it's up to TDLR whether they want to call it positive or not. There are occasions where if it is dilute, they will still report a positive dilute. But the fact that it's negative and it is dilute, they do suggest a recollection.
Wayne Lee, so you've done 3 years of collections, and I know you probably don't know off the top of your head, but do you have data on how many specimens like that are you getting per year?
It's limited. I'd say maybe once a month, not even. I'd say, one every other month. It's
That's
it
still, that's 12 a year.
happens, but it's rare. Well, we're doing, 100 and some tests. It's probably about maybe, I'd say 5%.
And that's for the TDLR collections, not all of your collections. I'm asking
That's just
about-
for combative sports.
Just for combative sports.
I mean, it happens. Federal drug tests, so we're not allowed to, I can't look at a specimen, even though it's crystal clear, I can't say it's dilute because I'm not the scientist. So let's say for like a DOT truck drivers, if it comes back dilute, they'll go ahead and suggest recollection. That person will have to come back in and redo it. But as for combative sports, I can't tell if it's dilute or not.
Yes, Dr. Schramm.
Dr. Schramm, question for Jim, just to follow up on the out-of-competition testing that some states do. Who pays for that? I know the promoters obviously pay for the in-competition, and I'm assuming it would be the athletic commission of that
So
state?
it varies from state to state. As was mentioned earlier, with California, I think they're set aside like $75,000 to do drug testing. They have another neuro fund that so much off of every ticket goes into a neuro fund, and that pays for some of the neuro testing. And out of competition is the same way. Now, VADA, being it's voluntarily, I think VADA takes care of a lot of it through sponsorships, but we don't have a policy for it because we don't do it, but it varies from state to state. Some states tag the promoter for it, some states tag the individual for it.
Thank you.
Any other questions
Yeah.
as far as the drug testing?
Yes, I like Manuel Gonzalez. I think that if you have a artificial metabolite in a diluted specimen, it's still positive. I mean, can you answer that?
What do you mean by like an artificial
Well,
metabolite?
you have a metabolite of a controlled substance,
Okay.
and it's diluted, it's still positive, right?
They will still call, yes, they will still, if they can determine it at the lab, if it's over the cutoff level, they'll report a positive result to me.
But if it's not autogenous, it's not ours, and you have a dilute specimen, and you have very low levels of a metabolite, from plants, for example.
Yeah, if they
That's
find.
still positive, right?
Yeah, if they find anything in there, they'll report it as a positive,
As positive.
even as it being a dilute specimen.
Okay.
But if it being negative and dilute, they suggest the recollection.
Any other questions?
Yes,
Last question.
Chris Reed. I agree with the protocol, that I think something like that needs to be established. Just so it doesn't look subjective, I think that, it would be good to see that all the sports are tested on the same substances. And, that way it's real transparent and everybody knows, going into it. And then lastly, the cost of the program itself. Some people may not have an opportunity to experience this at the fights, but I'm sure you have more than us. It becomes a really big burden on those tests at fight time for those guys. It'd be nice to see that some other way to look at maybe an increase to ticket prices, maybe a $1 increase on each license to help cover it. It benefits us all for those guys to be clean and safe. So it would be nice to see if if we were able to fund that broken out into several different categories and it probably puts a burden on you trying to deal with it that night, the cost of it that night.
I think that those are all good points, and I think that when we get to the work groups, when we get to the next meeting, we can go ahead and point those out. I think that we've covered pretty much everything extensively in terms of the drug testing protocols, and I think that's enough that we have information that we can at least get some conclusion on that, hopefully today. All right.
And if you guys have any other questions or in the future, they have my email and my contact information. You guys are more than happy to reach out to me with any other questions that you have.
Okay, thank you so very much. Going
Thank
to
you
the
guys
B-
very much.
Thank you. Going to the B section on concussion testing, are there any questions or any discussion at this point?
Did a great job.
No? I think when we go to the work group, one of the things that we probably will need to discuss in terms of what protocol will we use, and if we're not going to decide on a protocol, at least what information that we're going to provide to the fighter. And maybe one of those things that we can talk about in the work group is maybe taking the ringside position statement and talking about maybe having that on the website from TDLR. At least that's an initial start while we iron out some of the other things that we can work on from there. So that's a suggestion, but we'll go into it in more detail if there are no other questions. Moving to the C, dehydration and weight cutting. Any discussion, any comments?
I just had one comment, Dr. Schramm. It's my understanding that most of the weight cutting problems occur in MMA, not boxing.
Yes, sir.
And that's partly due to the fewer number of weight classes. And I would imagine that as MMA evolves, that there will be a greater number of weight classifications, and that problem should, over time, take care of itself. It's certainly important to be aware of weight cutting issues, but I think that's something probably that's going to need to evolve over time.
You're correct in that they are looking at adding more weight classes, and that was actually part of the 10-point plan. I think California added 2 weight classes. But even in the events that aren't for a title fight where they could actually fight at a catch weight, it's still, it's still very prevalent, and education is a problem for the fighters in that they're not fully understanding what they're doing to their bodies.
Dr. Taylor, I think you mentioned the last event where the athlete clearly talked about him cutting weight and how it had an effect. I mean, I think he was on the news. Having that on the website may also wake people up, saying how he almost died or whatnot because of the self-inflicted weight cut that he did, because I know it changed his behavior going forward. And that having that on the website may allow other fighters, when they review the website, to say, hey, this is what happened to that guy. And maybe may add that second thought about cutting the weight so drastically, because he was pretty descriptive in what he did, and that may be helpful.
Okay, again, good points, good comments. A lot of good discussion, and we did it in about an hour and a half, so that's pretty good, and I think that it was well received, and I'm sure that online they may also get some good information from that. Just to continue, I'd like to, just in terms of timeliness and stuff, if there's no objections, let everyone take a little 10-minute break, and then we can go right into the next section and then kind of iron out some stuff so we can get people out in a timely manner. We'll close this session, conclude the summit. Thank you very much.